Hello and welcome to the Boss It podcast. Today we're going to be talking about security. We'll probably talk about a lot of other things as well, actually. We were talking about lighting just a few moments ago. But I'd like to welcome the guest, Ted Harrington, who is the author of a book called Hackable. Welcome, Ted. Thanks for taking the time out to come and join this podcast. And I believe
Absolutely.
you're talking from Los Angeles.
I am indeed. We're across a pond right now.
Yes. The company that you've been working with, ISE, you've been there 10 years.
hmm
And based on that experience, you wrote this book, Hackable. Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So what we do at ISE, I should probably give that as I guess the canvas upon which we'll paint the illustration that is hackable because they're intertwined. So what we do at ISE is we're what are called ethical hackers. And when companies are building systems and they need to understand how those systems will be attacked and compromised, they work with companies like us. They work with ethical hackers who use the same sort of tools, techniques, strategies, methods as the attackers do in order to help understand where those vulnerabilities might lie and so they can fix them in order to build better, more secure systems. So that's what our business is. We also do that in the form of security research where someone's not paying us. We're just doing it in order to, drive an issue that we care about or to, publish something that we can then speak about at conferences, stuff like that. And the reason I mention all that is in the course of running a business like that, I spend a lot of time speaking with tech leaders in different industries, different sectors all over the world. And over the years of doing this, I noticed that I was really having the same conversations over and over and over and over again. And it really struck me that irrespective of geographic location, irrespective of industry sector, irrespective of company size, everyone had the same problems. And I organized them into about 10. There are about 10 different problems that everyone who's building a software system seems to have. Now, they might not all know them as the same terms, but they basically fall into these 10 categories. And I thought that was really interesting once I noticed that. And then I started thinking about, well, how do you solve those problems? And that was the moment that led to me writing the book, because I realized that the conventional solutions, the way that most people talk about solving those problems that everybody has, are wrong. And I didn't think that that was a condition that I should allow to exist anymore. And so I wrote this book that essentially addresses these common problems that everybody building a software system has and says, hey, here are the misconceptions. Most people think it's X, but really it should be Y. And here's how you go implement that. And so for that reason, it's, the book is filled with the same advice that we as consultants give to, our customers, the same advice we're publishing security research. And the hope is to help people build better, more secure systems.
Super. I'm sure that we'll get into some of those sort of 10 problems that you come across as we have this conversation today. But I understand that you've also got a business called Start. When did that start then? And what's that about?
Yeah, so Start is really interesting in that through the course of running the type of business that I just described, where we're doing these security testing engagements, essentially assessments, some people might call them audits, I would not, but helping organizations really understand their security flaws within systems. Of course, a big part of that is working with larger companies who themselves work with a large number of vendors. And people often ask me, what's the future of security? What's the big problem that everybody should be focused on? Where should we be investing money? Where should we be investing time and effort? And the answer to that is always, from me anyway, is this area that's called third-party risk management, or sometimes it's called vendor risk management. And it's the idea that a company who works with a lot of other companies to do their business, they need to trust those companies with things they care about. And for anyone here who has worked with a large company, you've probably been handed a security questionnaire and you have to fill out hundreds of questions in order to prove what your security posture is. And the enterprises then have to do something with that. And usually it's this cumbersome, manual, brutal process for the enterprise. And so we said there has to be a better way. And so we've been building this software system that simplifies that problem. And so it makes it easier for security teams to understand the security posture of their vendors, makes it easier for the vendors to communicate that information, makes it easier for the business users who want to know, can I use this vendor that I really like? Are they approved by the security team?
Right.
And we see this as a really massive problem because really, if you think about it, it almost doesn't even matter how much you invest in security of your own systems if your vendors are
Yes.
woefully insecure. And so that's the problem we're trying to tackle to start.
Okay, that's interesting. Does that have implications for software vendors? So your typical customer is going to be the end user of software, normally, I would assume. My audience are predominantly the software vendor. What implications do you think that there are for the software vendors themselves, the guys who are
Mhm.
developing software?
Yeah. So it's interesting because we have these, these two sides to the
Mm,
house. My ethical hacking side of the house, the customer to that is the company who's building software. So
yeah,
your listeners need services like I've described.
yeah,
The end user for the software system is typically, it's not the software vendor themselves, it's the company who's, hiring the software vendors. But if the primary audience here is the software vendors, let's talk about the vendor's pain. So this is the pain the vendor feels.
mm,
Um, the salesperson gets super excited because they have just gotten a meeting with like this landmark key account. And they're like, great, we're going to get into, fill in the blank major tech company. We're going to get into Google now or whatever.
yeah,
And they run into the buzzsaw, which is, hey, procurement says before we can do anything with you guys, you got to fill out this questionnaire. The questionnaire comes in and it's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of questions.
mm,
And those questions run the gamut, covering all areas from cybersecurity, compliance, physical security, even things like human trafficking and stuff like that, which are really critical issues to large enterprises. Like, how are you thinking about these problems? And if the software vendor is small, they're like, first of all, I don't even know how to answer these. I'm not a
yeah,
security professional. I
sure.
don't know what's going to happen when I send in, whether it's a right or wrong answer. Is it going to, flag all these other things? It takes all this time and effort. And so what the tool, well, let's not make this about my tool. Let's make this about the problem. So my tool simplifies that. But then what further complicates that is the way that most enterprises wind up doing it is it's sort of like a one size fits all. Like, you're a vendor of mine. I don't care if you touch our intellectual property or you sell me napkins. You have to answer this, several hundred questionnaire. And what the experience is for most vendors is like, that's annoying. This doesn't apply to my business. All I want to do is get the contract. What are we doing here?
Mm,
And I think that is not a great situation. And that's why myself and others in the vendor risk management space are really trying to simplify this problem. But the way most people think about it is they are primarily thinking about, how do we make this better for the enterprise? And we don't care if it's a pain for the vendor. And then there's some companies that are focused on, how do we make this good for the vendor? But it's not that useful for the enterprise. But no
mm,
one is saying, how do we do this so that it's good for everybody? And that's, I think,
mm.
the gap that we're targeting.
Okay, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that there would be a lot of the vendors out there that would identify with that frustration of the extended sales process and the obstacles to get away and
Mhm.
the compliance and regulation and the hoops that you have to jump through. So I think it's an interesting point.
Yeah,
What
one
what?
of the just before we move on, I think this will
Yeah,
be
no, go
helpful
ahead.
to your audience. One of the things that I did in Hackable is, I think the ultimate payoff, right, is for a company who's building some software and you're trying to change the world in whatever way you're trying to change the world, and you invest all this time and effort and money, and then it's like, well, what's the payoff? And I argue that the payoff, besides the fact that it's the right thing to do, like,
Mm,
everyone wants systems to be secure that they're using. That's sort of like a universal consensus that doesn't even need to be proven anymore at this point.
mm,
But that's not, I mean, we live in a capitalist world. That's not enough of a justification. And so, what is the justification? I argue that the justification is a system that is properly secured actually delivers you a competitive advantage. So for anyone listening, right, you're building this thing. You want to go convince that big major tech company that, or it doesn't have to be a tech company, but that big major company, they should hire your solution. You know this security questionnaire process is coming.
Yes.
So let's, instead of trying to minimize it and deflect and say that doesn't apply, and let's like, what do
Yes.
those things do to the enterprise? That makes them be like, wait a minute, do I trust you? Like, really, what the process is about building trust. And the way that most software companies think about this process actually builds fear. Right? What they're trying to do is they're trying to say, like, how do I make this not my problem? How do I avoid it? How do I say NA wherever possible? How do I say this doesn't apply to me? And the reason the enterprise is asking these questions is they want to know. They want to build trust. They're not saying, hey, if you don't have this thing, you are absolutely barred from working with us. They just want to know. And so one of the things that I do in Hackable, and to anyone that wants to talk to me, is advise on how to do that. So like chapter 10 is filled with, here's how you should approach security questionnaires. Here's how you should use the reports you get from your security assessing partner, your pen testing partner. Here's how you should use the security team in your sales process. Because security is an investment. It is not a tax. It's not a cost center. It's an investment. And the way to capitalize on it is to properly secure your system and then use that in the sales process as you're trying to close sales. Now, you can't do the second part without the first part. You can't just be like, well, we're going to skip the security part. We're going to say we're secure and then, move into procurement. That's actually what builds fear when you're trying to build trust.
Yes. That makes a lot of sense, because what you're trying to do in those early stages and throughout the sales process is build credibility and trust. And this is one way of doing it. It's not telling them you're professional. It's actually demonstrating it by what you've done, the preparation 100%. That you've made. And this is one particular area. Yeah. So two questions that are sort of tied up in a way here is, you've been in this area for a number of years. What are the changes and trends that you've seen regarding security? And what do you believe is the biggest security issue currently?
You can see it as evidenced by the fact that we started this business in vendor risk management, third-party risk management. I think that's one of the biggest. Not that has changed. Not that there has been this change that all of a sudden the supply chain risk, the third-party risk issue has appeared. That's always been there. It's that organizations are starting to realize it. And so that's where you're seeing companies of, I want to say all sizes, but really only after a certain revenue size can a company really do anything about it. But really it impacts all companies, right? This whole idea that every company relies on other companies to do its business. And by relying on other companies, you're providing access to things that that matter to you. And so trust is involved. And so this area of how do we marry those two, those problems, right? Where you've got, it's really fascinating, even the conversation we've had so far, right? That you've got on one side, you have the issues that the vendor themselves feel. They're trying to build something, they want to make sure it's secure. And then you've got the problem that the enterprise feels, where they say, well, I want to work with secure vendors. They both actually really do want the same thing. How do we make sure that it marries together? And this is only going to get bigger, this problem. One of the things that has really inspired me about that we're really on the right track by trying to pursue this problem set, in addition to the one we've been working on for many, many years, is that any conference I go to, I spend a lot of time delivering keynotes at security conferences, tech conferences, stuff like that. And any person that I ask about this problem, they're like, yes, I have that problem. Oh my God, we need to solve that. And whether they're the ones, the vendors who are suffering from these, just kind of crazy questionnaires sometimes, or they're the enterprises who are wanting those questionnaires, or back to the vendor side, if they're the vendor saying, look, I don't actually even know where to start. I want to secure my solution. I don't know how to do it. And then I don't know how to take that investment and make sure the enterprise trusts me. Those are three really fascinating problems, and it impacts pretty much every company.
What about as regards the things that are being done by by the criminals to penetrate organizations, that must be have evolved and become now more sophisticated. What are the differences that you've seen there?
Yeah, it's I don't mean to make this sound like I'm admiring attackers in any way, but it is kind of interesting seeing the way they evolve and adapt. And there's this sort of long abused phrase in security, right? That it's an arms race, and like, we have to keep up with the bad guys. And yeah, that's trite at this point, but it's true. We really are in a scenario where those of us on the defender side, and we are in a race with the attackers. They're constantly evolving. They're constantly adapting. And a great example of that would be something like ransomware.
Yes.
So ransomware, for anyone who's not familiar with it, I'll just define it real quick, is this idea where an attacker can essentially encrypt a victim's data and then say, give me money so you can have access to it again. Now, what's really fascinating about that is the idea of malware, right? Like getting a victim to install malware unwittingly, that has existed for a very long time. The idea of ransom, right? Holding something hostage in exchange for money, that's existed for a long time. But it was only a small number of years ago, maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, when an attacker combined the two and said, well, why don't I, encrypt this system and demand money to decrypt it? That's innovation. I mean, take out the malicious side to that. That truly is someone looking at a market and saying, well, how can I make money in a different way? And, this whole marketplace has spawned. And using the word marketplace is intentional. If we think about what's happening in the black market, right? So one of the things that attackers are always doing is that there's the ones who are really advanced and sophisticated, like nation states. They have all the resources and they can, they can really target specific companies or nations. What they'll do is they invent these things. They invent tools or techniques or whatever. And then someone eventually figures out, well, how do I make this available to the masses? It truly exists under the same sort of market forces and market dynamics that a traditional market would exist under. And so someone takes, a sophisticated attack technique and then figures out, well, how do I make it so that someone without the skills can buy it from me and do it at the push of a button? And we see that type of innovation happening in traditional markets as well. And if we go back to something like ransomware, one of the things that's really fascinating there is there are, I don't know exactly what they're called, but they're the equivalent of like the Better Business Bureau or like credit ratings for ransomware gangs. Because the question is, when you're the victim of this and you're going to pay this money, am I actually, they're literal criminals, right? Like,
Yes.
Are they actually going to decrypt my thing when I pay them? That's a valid question to ask. And so there's these rating bureaus you can go to and say, oh, well, these guys have an A+ rating. They always decrypt it when you give them your money.
Wow.
Like, that's a sophisticated market condition that exists. And the reason I'm mentioning all this and kind of ranting about these market conditions is to illustrate that attackers are constantly evolving, constantly adapting. At the same time, market conditions in our like normal markets are changing. Customers are asking for different things of software vendors, and the tech itself is changing. So all of this, if we can encapsulate it into, well, what do I do with this like scary dystopian world that Ted just described? What do I do with that? What you do with that is this. We have to revisit security very frequently. So you're building a software system. A lot of people think about, I'm going to do a penetration test annually or every 2 years or something like that. Well, no, you need to be thinking about security throughout the build process. You need to be testing it probably more like on a quarterly basis, depending on your release cadence. And the reason for that is not just because Ted's a security guy and he thinks that, more security is always better. But because we are in this constant battle, this constant evolution, and this is how we deal with it.
Well, it's an indication when there's a bureau that is sort of rating the security guys, the guys that are making money out of this. It shows you how prevalent it must be for it to be worthwhile to even do that. I heard I was talking to somebody, it was just probably a couple of months ago, of a guy from this industry, and he was head of IT in an organization, and his company got hijacked, and they weren't. It just locked them down,
Mm.
and he had to go to the CEO and say they were demanding, it was something like $5,000 or $10,000. It wasn't a massive amount. And the CEO said, just pay them. And he said, no, 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 I don't want to pay them. I'm going to sort this out. And he was working to try and get around it, and he couldn't. And in the end, he had to pay them, and he really hated doing it. When he'd paid them, they came back to him and said, could you recommend somebody else that we could go after? Is there any of your competitors you would like us to go after?
Wow. I haven't heard of that story
That's
yet. I'm gonna borrow
audacious,
that from
isn't
you.
it? Yeah, yeah.
It's audacious, but that's also, I mean, we're talking about mature, sophisticated business. That's a business practice, right? You
It's like
go
the
to your
reference.
customer and you say,
Yeah,
"What's the best way to grow your business?" Referrals.
yeah. I'd like a referral, but you send
That's
us to your
fascinating.
competitors. So it is amazing. You've also got a podcast that you do. Is that correct?
I do. Yeah.
Tech done right?
Tech done different. Yeah.
Oh, tech done different. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the sort of ethos around that is, when I was writing the book, one of the things I really enjoyed about it, well, there were many things I enjoyed about it, but one of those things was interviewing people.
yeah.
Really enjoyed reaching out to leaders in tech and saying, tell me about your problem. And it was fascinating to do
Mm,
that. And then when that part of the journey was over, I was like, well, I kind of want to keep doing this. I kind of want to find ways to keep sharing people's stories and understanding what problems people are facing and stuff like that. And I decided that I didn't necessarily want to do a security podcast. I wanted to talk to leaders in tech, and I felt like, would the CTO of, whatever, fill in your tech company, would the CTO of Uber, right, want to get on a podcast and talk about their security? Like, probably not. But I still wanted to know what that person's challenges were, and because that's ultimately who I serve in my life, is
mm,
leaders in tech. I bring the security advice, but that's the person is the leaders in tech. And then we started thinking about, okay, well, what's the common theme? Like, what is the driving force of security, in ethical hacking in particular? And it was this: how do we think differently? That's what hackers do. Hackers look at a system and say, well, everyone thinks it's supposed to do X, but can it do Y? And so I said, all right, well, let's build a podcast around that theme. And so we
mm.
basically get leaders. Well, it's for leaders in tech or leaders in security or people aspiring to that. The guests are sometimes from that community and sometimes outside of that community. And the whole vibe is, let's talk about misconceptions. Let's talk about how people think a certain thing works in a certain way and should work in a different way. And that's covers everything from, productivity, life hacks, whatever, leadership, how you built a company, how you sold a company. And then, of course, I'm a security guy, so we talk about security a lot too.
Yeah. I mean, one of the reasons that I started the Boss It podcast was I just found it very interesting to be able to have this sort of conversation. Quite often, I'd be talking in an area where I know something about, and it's sort of checking some of the thoughts and some of the trends that I see and see how they see it. And other times, it's like a window into an area where I know very little about, but you see things from their perspective. People who've got a lot of experience, and that can be really enlightening. So I enjoy that.
Totally.
And it enables you. I mean, the software tech sector is enormous, and it enables you to cover a lot of ground that way,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting. You mentioned that in Hackable, you have a lot of stories, and I think
I do.
stories work, especially probably when you're talking about the topic like this. People relate to stories. It's quite interesting because with the other business that I've got, which is Outsmart, which is about strategic positioning, when we're helping companies to articulate what they do in a more compelling and engaging way, one of the things that we often use is a story, because when you sit down and somebody says, I'm going to tell you a story, or they know they're about to be told a story, your brain actually changes the state that it's in, and we're much more receptive, and it's a way that we can create a mental model in our heads, or we can change a mental model. You can see things differently. Tell us one of the stories that sticks out to you that you've got in your book, or maybe that you've heard over the years around security
Sure.
that is sort of indicative.
I totally agree with you that, I mean, you don't need me to agree with the science agrees with it that stories helps us like engage
Yeah,
differently.
it
I've
does.
received this advice over the years that is like, well, don't tell someone you're about to tell them a story, just tell the story. And I'm like, I don't know. I mean, I personally, when I hear someone say, well, okay, let me tell you a story, I'm like, go on. It's
Yeah,
like I'm
exactly.
immediately sucked in.
That's right.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Well,
So
a story
I
that I
think
think
people do
is
prepare. That I don't think there's any harm in saying I'm going to tell you a story
yeah,
because people are preparing, if you like. It's much better. Quite often, I think I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation. It gives
oof,
you a different mental state, doesn't it?
that
We've
just hit
sat
me.
through those presentations, but if somebody says, "Let me tell you a story," it's
Yeah,
it's very different.
yeah,
We
yeah.
could be covering the same topic.
I totally agree with you on that. I was like, oh, I could tell PowerPoint stories. Well,
Yeah.
one of one of the stories that I like to talk about is really the origin story of how we built a company around this idea of ethical hacking, because I think it really conveys the idea of what ethical hacking even is. And so this was all the way back in early 2000s, and my business partner was in the PhD program at Johns Hopkins at the time, and there was this really prominent system that was used in automobiles that is to prevent theft.
Right.
And the particular system doesn't necessarily matter exactly what the system is, but it's called the immobilizer system. And essentially, what it did was it was a communication relay between the computer on board in the vehicle and the chip that's in your key. Like, this is why keys are so large and expensive to replace if you lose them, because they have a
Yes.
chip in it. And so there's this communication relay that basically says, is this the authentic key? Now, at the time, this particular system was considered to be, like, publicly stated, it was in documentation, unhackable. Like, people literally went out and said it couldn't be defeated. The
That's always
problem is,
dangerous for a start, isn't it? To actually start
it's
publicizing that.
yeah,
That's not
yeah,
great stuff.
you
It's
just
like a
shouldn't do that.
challenge.
Yeah. I mean, that's actually why I called the book hackable, because I was thinking about that story. I'm like, what's the opposite of
Oh,
unhackable?
wow. Yeah, that's
And
good. I like
so
that.
it's like hackable.
Yeah.
So this system's considered unhackable, and the problem, as you've correctly identified, of course, is that any hacker-minded computer scientist is going to say, challenge accepted. Let's
Yeah.
go. And so that's what they did. And so we set out. We sort of took a few weeks to reverse engineer the cryptographic algorithm, a few weeks to build a software radio, and then a few weeks to actually prove concept. And there we were. I mean, it was like 6 weeks later. It wasn't even that long. Proving concept by starting a Ford Escape without the authentic key, like entirely using a weaponized software radio. And I have this video of it that's like super amateur. It's so old. It looks like it's shot on a camera phone. It's awful video, but
Yeah.
it's the moment is really powerful when you see the car, like you hear it start like vroom, and you're like, whoa,
Yeah.
that you're not supposed to be able to do that. And that story alone, that launched the company, right? Once we published that research, at the time, no one was hacking things publicly in that way. The way that most companies dealt with security researchers was to sue them. So the fact that we didn't get sued, I think, is kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
And once the news came out about it, companies came calling and saying, like, "Hey, you understand how systems are defeated? Can you help us?" And that's actually that's still today the basis of the business, is how do we help companies who are building things understand how they'll be attacked, help them fix them. Yeah.
I've got a video. I ought to send it to you actually. Three and a half years ago, I had a Range Rover, and I'd been out somewhere, and I came back um, quite late, um, and I got up the next morning, and my car was gone. Unfortunately, we had some
Mm.
security, and we could see that there was a team of 5 people. So I don't live in a very busy area. It's very quiet. There was a van that pulled up at sort of the end of the lane, and there was 2 other cars. And earlier in the day, a car had come up the lane taken a photograph of my car. You could actually see them sending the image of the car to somebody. And this was at about 7:30, 8 o'clock.
Hmm.
And then they'd obviously been watching the house. I'd got out, I'd come back, I was still up. And then two people approached the house, and they sort of followed a line so that they could keep a low profile, duck down. They put a device up against the door, and it was the size of a phone.
Hmm.
The door opened immediately. They went inside, you could see it, and they started up the car and they
Hmm.
drove away. A lot of people said, oh, they've boosted your key. They hadn't. There was nothing from the key. They just had a device that they could just lay on there. And in the area, there must have been, since then, there have been 25 cars, Range Rovers. So they've obviously hacked that. And there's a team that's been targeting this area, stealing Range Rovers. And it was
Yeah.
so easy. It was shockingly easy.
Yeah. That's fascinating. I hadn't heard about the Range Rover exploit in particular, but that doesn't surprise me that if they found something exploitable about the way a particular vehicle works,
Yeah.
and then the plan is go find vehicles of that type. That's, I mean, obviously it's illegal and unethical, but there's a clear systematic process to how they did that.
Yeah. He said, and I had a SIM card in the car for the phone, which I'd forgotten about. And months later, I found out that the car was in Nigeria. So they'd obviously
Oh wow,
taking it, put it into a container, and sent it out the country. Yeah.
wow,
So
that's bonkers.
yeah, it is. What what are the goals for you and your business next? Where are you going? What do you see happening over the next few years?
Yeah, so on the side of the security consulting, the security testing business is just continuing more of that, right?
Yeah.
Further market penetration, continuing to like the service is super refined and proven, and we know that there's incredible demand for it. And so it's continuing to do that. We'll have to keep educating because one of the maybe the bad things about the awareness about the need for security testing is that because everyone wants, just like anything, people want things to be easy and cheap and quick. There are plenty of companies out there willing to sell what appear to be ethical hacking for easy, quick and cheap, and unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. So we'll have to keep educating why, like, well, just running a scanner isn't quite the same thing as figuring out how to exploit your software, and this is why it costs 10 times as much. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, everyone wants to spend $5,000 to do something, but it just doesn't work that way. So for that side of the house, more of the same. Industry growth
And
is essentially the mission.
if somebody wants
And
to reach
then
out to you on that side and they want to be able to use your services, what's the easiest way to find you?
yeah, I'd say for anything that we've talked about today, the simplest is just tedharrington.com. It's just my name is my website. All my
Oh, okay.
contact info is there. We have links to our security consulting company, to our vendor risk management company, to where to find me on social media, to how to book me for keynotes, whatever. It's simpler to say, like, well, for this
Sure.
thing go to there, and for that thing go to there. So it's sort of like the
Yeah,
central
yeah.
hub for
I've
everything we
yeah,
talk
you're
about.
right. I had a similar sort of issue, and I sort of point people in different directions. But yeah, I'll have to think about that one.
Yeah, it's easier to just
Set
do
up a
one
.com.
simple place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And then on the other side of the business,
Yeah, so the other side of the business is we're on the path for, running a software company, just like anyone listening to this knows, is a journey on feature development, establishing product market fit. We've already established product market fit, which is pretty exciting. We've already accumulated a handful of those sort of blue chip customers, enterprise customers that everybody wants as references, and now we just want to expand from there as we continue to enhance the product and make the capabilities better fit for our customers, make it continually easier to use, and that's just product roadmap is
yeah.
the mission there. So
What's the biggest lesson that you've learned in business? Something that you always sort of think about as a guide, if you had to pass on, an important lesson that you've learned maybe to the next generation, what would that be?
Mhm. Well, for me personally, and I feel like this probably applies to a lot of other people, but I can't necessarily say for sure. So I'll just say from my own experience, uh, what has been meaningful for me has been to really identify the sort of core principles that matter to me and to do work that aligns with those principles. And I've identified three. And the first is to do hard things that matter. I mean, that encapsulates what the mission of ethical hacking is, right? Like, it's really hard and it really matters.
Mm,
Um, the second thing is to serve others. And this is, I see the best ethical hackers feel this way, that the purpose is not to make themselves look good, although they will look good in the process, but it's to make the customer, you know, achieve what they're trying to achieve. Security should serve the business, security should not halt the business.
mm.
And then the third is to get better every day. So people often talk, any high performer talks about this idea of incremental gains. It's not about inspiration. It's not about like, oh, today I'm gonna go run a marathon. It's about dedication. It's about, okay, every day I'm gonna get out and I'm gonna run a little bit so that in 6 months from now I can run a marathon. And those three principles, they've really guided my life. They are the kinds of things that I see inherent across all aspects of the entire cybersecurity industry. And they're the kinds of things that I look for when I'm hiring people. And so hopefully that's helpful to someone else to recognize you probably already feel that way, some or maybe even all of those, but recognizing that these sort of, maybe let's call them the softer sides of running a business. A lot of people might be like, oh, know the market in and out, run the analytics. But it's like, yeah, those obviously you have to do those things.
Yeah.
But if you're not, like, from the inner being of your core of who you are as a human, if you're not invested in what you're trying to do, and for me those three areas are what do that, you're just never really gonna achieve elite performance.
You've been asked that question before, haven't you?
I've thought about it for a very long
Yeah,
time.
I can tell. I can tell. Let me throw a question at you that you probably haven't been asked then. What's going to be the legacy you leave behind?
I hope that the legacy that I've been building with ISE is what the legacy will be that we leave behind, which is building a community of people who really reject conventional thinking in order to help people build better, more secure systems. And who, like, with any company, right, you don't know what's going to happen 10, 20, 30, 100 years from now. So, like, once I'm no longer of this earth, what will be left behind? And my hope is that by building a company that really is built around this idea of community, I've been able to impact so many lives, so many families. I mean, we just had our company picnic literally last weekend, and at one point I had this sort of moment of awe as I'm looking around, and every single person who's there represents a family who's, maybe it's just themselves, or maybe it's, they have kids and wives and all this stuff. And I'm looking at them and I'm realizing, like, all these people are doing meaningful work. They're here on a Saturday. They do not have to be here. They're choosing to be here because they like the people they work with. They like the work that they're doing. And I mean, that's what any leader should be aspiring to do, is how do you make your impact bigger than yourself? And so hopefully that's the legacy that I'm leaving, is impacting others who then can turn around and do similar things themselves for the people in their worlds.
That seemed like several things actually about build a community, think differently, and leave a positive impact behind. Great.
Those are the three key components to our mission statement, actually. Yeah.
Really? Excellent.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
very consistent then. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been an interesting podcast. If people want to reach out to you, it's very easy. It's tedharrington.com. Any final thoughts to leave with the audience of Boss It?
Yeah. A lot of what we talked about today might sound scary, might sound daunting. It's like, oh, it's gonna be expensive. It's gonna be hard. I don't know what penetration testing is. I don't know what ethical hacking is. I don't know any of this. Like, just recognize that, yes, like anything we're doing, it is hard. So is building a software company. That's hard,
Yeah.
right? But there are the security community is very passionate about helping you solve that problem. So use me as a resource. So don't hesitate to, reach out to me on LinkedIn or whatever, email me, and just ask advice. Like I'm here because I want to give advice. I'd be happy to give advice to anybody who reaches out. You'd be surprised how few people actually take me up on that very real, earnest offer. Use me as a resource, and I help however I can.
Superb. Thank you very much for today, Ted. And there's a challenge. Reach out to Ted. Please do use him. It's been fascinating to talk about this area of the business. I've not done this before on the podcast, but I'm pleased that I did, and it stimulated a number of thoughts for myself. As always, please do reach out to me if you've enjoyed the podcast. Reach out to me if you haven't, and if you want me to do things differently. But also, if you've got a good story to tell, or you know somebody's got a good story to tell and you'd like to see them on the Bossy podcast. Till then, look after yourself and keep well. Thanks very much.